This is essentially a three-pronged approach to evaluating player situation in fantasy football this year. It takes really three things into account here. Number one, the team's red zone and touchdown percentages from the year prior. Number two, the strength of schedule and also the rest score, which is basically how much time they have between games, who gets the most favorable schedule in that aspect. And then number three, the offensive line, the wide receivers, the running backs, the overall team talent score. According to Warren Sharp, from his analysis is where we got these scores. And so we kind of took some of this analysis and we put it into a spreadsheet here. Actually, Dustin did. Shout out Dustin, one of our research analysts, and he helped put this together so we could do a video on it. And now we're going to look at the overall rankings when you take those three factors and see who has the best situation this year to perform in fantasy football. Do us a huge favor. If you play fantasy football, please subscribe for us. Really helps us out. We really appreciate it. And also, most of you aren't subscribed, and we know that because we have data that supports it. So make sure you subscribe because we also play fantasy football. We're going to bring you good data this year. But let's talk about this in all three categories. So I'll start and I'll do red zone and touchdown rankings. There are a couple different statistics here in this graph. We can just have a sample of this on the screen. And basically what this is it takes into account your red zone drive rate. So how many drives of yours, of a team's, end up in the red zone, and then basically how many touchdowns are produced from those drives. And this is important because you can also calculate from here, your total offensive touchdowns. And then from this, you can kind of get the most touchdown heavy and most offensively productive teams in the league, which when you're talking about fantasy football, we saw this with running backs. It's true for every position. The most consistent, the highest end players score the most touchdown. Yards are important. Receptions are important. All that is great. But touchdowns reign supreme in terms of scoring fantasy football points because of the amount of reward you get for one single play. One touchdown play gets you a minimum of 6 points for wide receivers and running backs in those type of leagues, right? And so there's a huge payoff. And so when you're looking at kind of the top guys in this part of the part of the rankings here, the 49ers were first in terms of red zone and touchdown offense. The Bills were second. The Lions were third. The Cowboys fourth. The Ravens fifth. Dolphins sixth. The Eagles seventh. So again, what the overall product after we get through each of these sections is going to combine all of these, but the next section here that Dustin kind of looked at that we're paying attention to here too, that I'll let you talk about, is the team positional rankings, where it basically combines the offensive line score, the running back score, wide receivers, all of it, and kind of ranks them based on how Warren Sharp had these teams graded out.
Yeah, I think this is especially applicable to running back specifically, right? Offensive line score is gonna be a big deal for determining who ends up being the most, the best strength of schedule, the best opportunity for running backs to be productive in their respective offenses. So there are going to be a couple of surprises here with some players that we ended up having to mention because there's some guys that we're a little bit lower on that we're going to have to kind of re-explore the potential opportunity they might have in the offense and end up being potentially productive as well. And then you've got QB score as well, right? So the quarterback situation in that offense is really going to significantly impact how we feel about players in certain offenses. Drake London last year was one of those guys that we were really low on because Desmond Ridder was throwing him the ball. What ended up happening? Drake London severely disappointed because Desmond Ridder was throwing him the ball, right? So you're going to see a lot of these teams with some of the best situations heading into 2024. You've got Jared Goff, a very pass-heavy quarterback that's very efficient. Jalen Hurts, Brock Purdy, Patrick Mahomes. The Chiefs are always going to be up there in terms of the ideal situations for productive assets to put up points there. So it's interesting to look at.
And then the third part of this research is, again, the strength of schedule and the schedule rankings. So this takes into account the basic strength of schedule that Warren Sharp has outlined in his analysis, and then the net rest that they get. So again, this is going to be determined by the amount of primetime games when this happens, when your bye week is in relation to those primetime games. And we've seen this make a pretty big difference with overall player performance throughout an entire 18-game season. I mean, a 17-game season.
Like the Cowboys having 3 Thursday night games.
Correct. And so and now we're playing 17 games, 18 weeks. If we go to 18 games, it's going to be even more of a factor here.
Yes.
But when we're looking at strength of schedule is something that everybody targets in fantasy football, especially at the end of the season, right? Everybody wants playoff players that have the easiest strength of schedule so they can pop off in those playoff weeks. And so which teams have the easiest strength of schedule and the most rest combined this year? And so we kind of combine those scores, and then you look at the Eagles, the Atlanta Falcons, the Chicago Bears, the New York Jets, the Chiefs, the Ravens, the Panthers, the Packers, the Jaguars, all teams that rank in the top 10 for these two metrics, in the Vikings as well, honestly. And this is really favorable for players on their team to be the most well-rested and also face the lesser competition in terms of comparing them to some of the other teams in the league here. And so with those three things in mind, basically what Dustin did is he created an overall rankings sheet here where it combined all those rankings and it basically took,
Found
all
the best
of them,
values at every
averaged them out, and
round.
basically gave you the best situations based on the overall team and the talent on the team, including offensive line, things like that, the strength of schedule, and then again, the red zone and touchdown rankings. So let's look at the best situations in the league based on those three factors, and then let's talk about some players to target.
For fantasy this year, I love seeing the Eagles at number one in terms of strength of schedule. I absolutely love it because when you're looking at last year, aside from the locker room just crashing and burning and the Eagles as a whole crashing and burning, that strength of schedule towards the end of the season was brutal. They had so many tough games in the latter half of the season, and we knew that was coming, but man, they fell apart, and they started facing injuries that they didn't the previous year before, and it sucked because A.J. Brown, who was looking like one of the bigger league winners in fantasy football, took a big hit as well. Well, I'll tell you what, this year, man, A.J. Brown from an ADP perspective didn't take that much of a hit, but he also didn't rise from 2023 to 2024. And I think that's going to be a big reason why we think that A.J. Brown is one of the better targets that you can take in the first round of your fantasy drafts for 2024. Because when you're looking at his splits from like weeks 1 to 8, 1 to 9 before the bye week, he was literally a top 3 wide receiver. Depending on what format you were in, he was wide receiver 1 overall. Next, right by Tyreek Hill. Like, it was unbelievable what he was doing. He was absolutely dominant, and he didn't lose that dominance towards the end of the season. The Eagles as a whole, again, they just fell apart. And I know I don't want to give excuses for why A.J. Brown ended up not being as productive as we thought that he could be, but if you string together a whole season of first half of 2023 A.J. Brown, you are legitimately looking at a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy. Easily. He has the upside too. He is a true alpha wide receiver alongside Devonta Smith with Saquon Barkley in the backfield, with Jalen Hurts throwing him the ball. I mean, it doesn't matter which way you cut it. A.J. Brown is going to be the most productive asset in that offense next to Jalen Hurts.
Period.
He absolutely is, period. And this is a big reason why I like Saquon Barkley as well. I think A.J. Brown's dominance really helps Saquon. I think it really opens up the field for Saquon like it never has been opened up for him in New York for so many years because he was the best asset on that team and they never had a quality receiving asset alongside Saquon. So, I mean, you're looking at everyone on that offense and you're at least seeing safety. At the very least, A.J. Brown is going to be a top 6 to 8 wide receiver barring injury.
Bingo. All right, let's talk now about Josh Jacobs. And Josh Jacobs is a guy this year that we've pretty much been telling people to avoid. And I don't think this necessarily changes that, but it's worth considering some of the metrics here, especially how the Packers graded out in some of these numbers here. The red zone and touchdown percentages. The Packers here graded out 9th in terms of they had a really high red zone drive rate, and then as a result, they had a lot of red zone touchdowns. Now, granted, they didn't have as many percentage of touchdowns in the red zone, but again, that doesn't necessarily need to be true. What it basically tells you is when they are scoring touchdowns, a lot of times they're scoring touchdowns, that are bigger plays. And so with Josh Jacobs, I'm not sure how that impacts him, but let's look at the team positional rankings here. The Packers here grade 6th, right? Their offensive line score is 75. It's not bad at all. They're kind of really solid all across the board, and that kind of lands them here. And so nothing special, but also nothing, definitely nothing that concerns me there. And when you're looking at the schedule rankings as well, the Packers are, again, top 10. They're 7th in the league. And so all of these three things combined for the Packers, when you're looking at the overall rankings for these 3 factors, they are 4th on this list, meaning they have the 4th highest, most favorable set of circumstances of any of these teams in the league. And what this tells me is that this is going to be a lot better situation for Josh Jacobs. And you could say, oh, yeah, well, you're a genius. You could have figured that out without looking at all those numbers. True. My concern was not necessarily that the situation wouldn't be better, because I figured it would. The Matt LaFleur offense is always going to beat whatever that was in Vegas. But I do think that there was a little bit of concern that Josh Jacobs was just inefficient enough as a player now and reaching that point in his career where I didn't believe in him to be productive. I also, thought maybe the other running backs could take away from him. That's changed a little bit now. You've heard, some of the speculation around Marshawn Lloyd, him not being ready, and, Matt LaFleur even publicly coming out and saying, like, we got to get him. He's got a long way to go, right? And,
because he showcased on film a lot in college how poor his vision is. That was a big risk when they took him.
It's a big risk.
Yeah.
And A.J. Dillon is A.J. Dillon, right? And so all of that leads you to think, okay, maybe Josh Jacobs could get enough volume in a good enough offense with a friendly enough schedule to be one of the better picks at running back this year. Not to mention, when you're investing in him as a running back in a fantasy football draft, you're getting him in the 3rd round. Mm-hmm. And so that's the flip side of what we've been telling you all offseason is some of the external factors outside of Josh Jacobs, individual talents and efficiencies and things like that around him, the environment's pretty good. Everything around him is sufficient for a running back of his caliber to produce at a running back 1 level. Whether or not he will, I think it remains to be seen, but it's definitely worth at least speculating on the fact that Josh Jacobs is in a position, theoretically this year, to perform as a high-end running back. I mean, you could even say a low-end running back 1 or mid-running back 1 like he did, when he was leading the league in carries. I mean, he's not that far removed from a really good year. It's just we have our concerns about Josh Jacobs.
Yeah, and just make sure you're being attentive of the price here. I mean, on Fantasy Pros, with the average of a bunch of different fantasy interfaces, he's going about consensus end of the 2nd round, ADP 23. I've seen him fall a lot lower than that. I've seen him go at the end of the 3rd round. If you've got a full round difference between where he's avoid him at the higher end, you can take a shot on him at the lower end because there's a huge price discrepancy there. There's a lot of variance with Josh Jacobs' price in fantasy right now. Next guy that we're going to have here with strength of schedule is Dalton Kincaid, and just straight up situation. Stephon Diggs is gone. Gabe Davis is gone. I'm not playing a vacated volume fallacy here because I saw what Dalton Kincaid did last year as a rookie tight end with Josh Allen, with Stephon Diggs in that offense, with Gabe Davis in that offense, and now they're going to look entirely different, right? You saw in the middle of the season while the Bills were struggling, you saw the offense as a whole schematically shift to a more 12 personnel, run first type of offense and not as many crazy shots taken downfield outside of, Superman Josh Allen having to win them games all the time. But Dalton Kincaid is perfect for this new looking Bills offense. And we don't know how long it's going to look like this, but they drafted Dalton Kincaid for a reason last year, and that was to be the next Travis Kelce for the Buffalo Bills, right? It was to play that role where he can be a short to intermediate target for Josh Allen, a security blanket that he honestly was starting to lose in Stephon Diggs because of how they were starting to change the way their offense was done, which did not center around Stephon Diggs anymore, right? It wasn't Stephon Diggs friendly. Houston is Stephon Diggs friendly. Dalton Kincaid is perfect for the Buffalo Bills this year, and the strength of schedule is favorable. All these metrics are favorable for Dalton Kincaid to be top 5 producing tight end in fantasy this year.
When you look at the other teams around them, the Eagles have Dallas Goedert, the Ravens have Mark Andrews, the Chiefs have Travis Kelce, the Packers just drafted a rookie wide receiver, actually 2 rookie tight ends last year, that are looking at least promising, right? The Lions have Sam Laporta. They spent a high draft pick on a tight end as well. And then it's the Bills. Mm-hmm. All of the teams, and even the top 3 teams that you've seen compete for championships in the last few years, I would say are the Chiefs, Ravens, and 49ers, and all of them have an elite tight end.
Yep.
Every single one of them. And so I think the Bills have caught onto that scenario. You've clearly seen them kind of adjust their play style, and I think Kincaid's going to benefit from that as well. Let's talk about David Montgomery, and by default, you need to talk about Jahmyr Gibbs. And when we've talked about Jahmyr Gibbs, I think a lot of people have kind of taken what we said about Jahmyr Gibbs the wrong way, because we said, hey, we're not drafting as much Jahmyr Gibbs as other people. He's probably our least favorite target in the later round of round 1, or the later end of round 1, which is true. But just because he's somebody we're drafting a little bit less of than other players doesn't mean he's a bad pick, because the one thing you can say about Jahmyr Gibbs, with his receiving upside and the type of skill set he has, and with as good as he was at the end of last season, is that he's a pretty safe pick. Right? The safety and the floor is very high there. And Jahmyr Gibbs, I'm confident if I draft him, I know what I'm getting from him. The main thing with that is when I'm going for running back in that range, I'm really shooting for upside, right? It's why I'm more inclined to wait and draft a Saquon Barkley in the 2nd than go Jahmyr Gibbs in the 1st. But Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, when you're looking at this research, the Lions here are 4th or 5th rather in the overall combined ranking. And when you're looking at some of the individual things here, the Lions have the 3rd best overall team score here.
And they were 3rd overall in red zone touchdowns as well.
Exactly. And, the schedule is not exactly the most favorable for them, 22nd in the league. So really their rankings being propped up by the fact that they're an elite offense.
And how they utilize David Montgomery specifically.
Exactly. And so you can make this about Jahmyr Gibbs, but really David Montgomery, we feel like is a really safe option that's going to get a ton of touchdowns, and you're getting him way cheaper.
You've seen it 2 years straight now, right? It's not David Montgomery the talent. It's not Jamal Williams the talent. It's the Lions and how they run their offense, and that is they give that rushing threat that is not the receiving threat in Jahmyr Gibbs, a lot of those goal line opportunities. So as much as we like Jahmyr Gibbs, a talent, and as much as we think he could be very productive this year with his receiving upside alone, you do have to take into account the fact that David Montgomery is going to get his own in that offense, and that ain't going to end.
Yep, absolutely. All right, talk about Jaylen Waddle.
Jaylen Waddle is a guy that I think we're expecting a bounce back from this year. Will it be as elite and productive as it was in 2022 with, finishing as like the wide receiver 10, 11, something like that?
No.
Probably not, especially with Achane now in that offense and Jalen Wright coming in. He could potentially put a dent into that offense as well and maybe even take away some more touchdowns. But the Dolphins overall, in terms of favorable strength of schedule, they're seventh in the league. And we know... We know how many touchdowns they score. I mean, they almost set the record for the most points in a single game against the Broncos in the early part of last season. So I think with Waddle, when you take into account the fact that he played with injury last year, missed a significant amount of time, and the running backs in the Dolphins offense accounted for 33 touchdowns, that's insane. That's absolutely insane. The Dolphins only had 38 red zone touchdowns last year. That's not only. That's, still top 8 in the league. But that's still, 33 touchdowns from the running backs, 38 red zone touchdowns. You're probably assuming that at least 25 to 30 of those were taken by the running backs
right.
in the red zone. And Jaylen Waddle, right.
Yeah.
And you're still going to see a significant chunk of those taken from the running backs, but I think you just saw the high end of what Waddle could do in 2022 and the low end of what he might do in 2023. And I think we're going to kind of come back in the middle where he's going to be very productive. He will be boom bust, but he's going to have some really good weeks for you, and he's going to be worth a pick probably where he's going at ADP.
I think predicting a bounce back for Jaylen Waddle is a good idea. So, and then the last guy here is going to be Zay Flowers. And the Ravens, in terms of, their red zone touchdown percentage, they grade out in the top 5 there. And in terms of their team overall, as you know, they have one of the best rosters and one of the best offensive systems in the league, and the best quarterback in the league, technically, won MVP last year. And so they're top 10 in that metric as well. And when you go to their strength of schedule, you'll notice they have the 4th hardest strength of schedule in the league. But they also have the highest rest score of any team in the league. So although they're going to be playing pretty steep competition this year there in Baltimore, they're going to be rested more than any other team in the NFL in terms of how their schedule is set up, which is very favorable. The Ravens are going to have a fair amount of primetime games, so this makes sense. But again, this is something we calculated, and so for the Ravens, you can you can expect them to have fresh legs. You can expect them to face good competition. But John Harbaugh coach teams are typically in a pretty good position to do so. And the other factors there. We talked about this. There's a lot of data that supports Zay Flowers breaking out this year anyways, but the situation around him is also going to kind of warrant that as well. So again, these are players that, and these are just, I think this is, shout out Dustin. I think this was a really good idea to kind of come up with these three metrics, because this really does kind of define the situation around a player in fantasy football. The offense around them, how hard is their schedule and how much rest are they getting?
Have you seen the Niners net rest, by the way?
No. They're
dead last in the league, minus 21.
We could do more videos on this, honestly, because there's some really interesting stuff in here.
Yeah, because they're a team that depends on their rest too.
Yeah, that's for sure. But do us a huge favor, drop a like on this video, make sure you subscribe, like I said, and make sure you go to flockfantasy.com/domain to get our draft guide. Use code domain when you sign up and choose any mother flocker tier. Get our draft guide, get access to our leagues. We're doing like 7 leagues live on our channel from now until the start of the season. So if you want to get in one of those, or have a chance to get in one of those, or have a chance to be in the drawing, flockfantasy.com/domain. Use code domain, like I said, choose mother flocker tier. Appreciate you guys. We'll see you later.